The gallows cast a long shadow across Steins Pass, New Mexico, as the morning sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky. Pearl Kendrick kept her head high, despite the jeers from the crowd gathered to witness her hanging. Her wrists were bound tightly before her, the rope chafing against her skin as Sheriff Tanner and his deputy marched her through the dusty Main Street toward her death in the spring of 1878. "Murderer!" someone shouted from the crowd, followed by a chorus of agreement. Pearl didn't flinch. 26 years old and facing death, she had already cried all her tears during the 3 weeks she'd spent in the jailhouse after being convicted of killing her employer, the wealthy rancher Harold Miller. "Keep moving," Deputy Wilson growled, shoving her forward when she slowed her pace. The wooden steps of the gallows loomed ahead. Pearl had maintained her innocence from the moment she was arrested, but no one believed that a simple housekeeper hadn't poisoned her employer for his money. The evidence had been circumstantial at best. She had prepared his final meal and had been named in his will, but in a town like Steins Pass, that had been enough. As they approached the gallows, the executioner stood ready, his face impassive as he adjusted the noose. Pearl's legs began to tremble, but she refused to beg or plead. Death would at least be a release from the nightmare her life had become. The crowd had swelled to include nearly every resident of the small town. Some faces showed grim satisfaction, others morbid curiosity, and very few showed doubt or sympathy. Pearl recognized Mrs. Holloway, for whom she had once worked, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Sheriff Tanner guided Pearl to the steps. "Time to pay for your crimes, Miss Kendrick." That's when they heard it, the thundering of hooves cutting through the murmur of the crowd. People turned and parted as a rider on a chestnut stallion galloped toward the gallows, dust billowing behind him. "Stop the execution!" The man shouted, pulling his horse to a dramatic halt before the platform. His voice carried across the suddenly silent crowd. "I have new evidence." Sheriff Tanner's hand moved instinctively to his holster. "Lucas Irwin," he said, recognizing the rider, "this is a legal proceeding. You'd best ride on." Lucas Irwin dismounted in one fluid motion, his tall frame and broad shoulders casting an imposing silhouette against the morning sun. His dark hat was pulled low over his eyes, and a week's worth of stubble covered his jaw. At 31, he had earned a reputation as one of the most skilled trackers in the territory and one of the most stubborn men. "I won't ride on while you hang an innocent woman," Lucas said, his voice level but firm. He held up a leather satchel. "I've spent the last 2 weeks tracking down the truth, and what I found will change everything." Pearl stared at the man, her heart suddenly pounding with hope she hadn't dared to feel since her arrest. She knew Lucas Irwin by reputation, only a former Texas Ranger who had settled near Steins Pass 3 years ago, working as a rancher and occasionally helping the sheriff's office with tracking outlaws. He had no reason to help her, a woman he'd never met. "This is highly irregular," Judge Peterson said, stepping forward from his place near the gallows. "The trial is over, Mr. Irwin. The verdict was reached fairly." "The verdict was reached without all the facts," Lucas countered, taking a step forward. "I've got proof that Miller was poisoned before Miss Kendrick ever served him dinner." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Tanner raised his hand for silence. "And how would you know anything about this case, Irwin?" he demanded. "You weren't even in town when Miller died." "I wasn't," Lucas agreed, "but I knew Miller. We had business dealings. When I heard a woman was convicted of killing him on such flimsy evidence, I decided to look into it myself." Pearl could scarcely breathe. Who was this man who had apparently been investigating her case while she sat in a cell awaiting death? And what could he possibly have found that her court-appointed lawyer had missed? Judge Peterson looked uncomfortable but nodded to the sheriff. "Let's hear him out, Tanner. If he has legitimate evidence, we're obligated to consider it." The sheriff reluctantly gestured for his deputy to bring Pearl down from the steps of the gallows. The crowd pressed closer, eager to witness this unexpected turn of events. Lucas approached Pearl, his hazel eyes meeting hers directly for the first time. "Miss Kendrick," he said with a slight nod, "I believe you've been wronged and I aim to prove it." "Why?" Pearl whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Why would you help me?" A flicker of something determination, perhaps, or principle crossed his weathered face. "Because the truth matters," he said simply. Judge Peterson cleared his throat. "This isn't the place for this discussion. Let's reconvene at the courthouse in 1 hour. The execution is temporarily stayed pending review of this. New evidence." As the crowd began to disperse, their disappointed murmurs filling the air, Pearl felt the weight of their judgment still pressing upon her. But for the first time in weeks, there was also something else, a fragile, tenuous hope. The sheriff kept a firm grip on Pearl's arm as they walked toward the courthouse, with Lucas Irwin following closely behind. Pearl glanced back at him, still unable to comprehend why this stranger had ridden in to save her life. "Mr. Irwin," she said quietly, "I don't know what you think you found, but I'm grateful you came." He met her gaze steadily. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Kendrick. We've still got a fight ahead of us." The small courthouse was stifling in the late morning heat as Judge Peterson took his seat at the front of the room. Pearl sat at a table with her original attorney, a young man named Thomas Webb, who looked as surprised as anyone by this turn of events. Lucas stood nearby, his satchel placed on the table before him. "Mr. Irwin," Judge Peterson said, "this is most irregular, but I'll hear what you have to say. Present your evidence." Lucas nodded and opened his satchel. "First," he said, pulling out several folded papers, "I have statements from 3 witnesses in Santa Fe who saw Harold Miller arguing with Jasper Dawson 2 days before Miller's death." He laid the papers on the judge's desk. Dawson was Miller's business partner, and they were disputing over a significant sum of money. Sheriff Tanner frowned. "That's hardly evidence of murder, Irwin." "I'm not finished," Lucas replied calmly. He pulled out a small glass vial. "This is the same type of poison that killed Miller. I found it hidden in Dawson's desk when I tracked him to Tucson." Whispers erupted around the courtroom. "And how did you gain access to Mr. Dawson's desk?" Judge Peterson asked, raising an eyebrow. "Let's just say I can be persuasive when necessary," Lucas said, a hint of steel in his voice. Pearl watched him with growing amazement. This man had traveled to multiple cities, confronted a potential killer, and returned with evidence all for her, a woman he had never met. "There's more," Lucas continued, producing a leather-bound journal. "This is Miller's personal account book. In it, he documents that Dawson had embezzled nearly $5,000 from their cattle business. He wrote here," Lucas flipped to a marked page, "that he intended to confront Dawson and dissolve their partnership upon his return from Santa Fe." Judge Peterson took the book and examined it. "This appears to be genuine," he admitted. "But the most damning evidence," Lucas said, pulling out a final document, "is this confession from Miller's stable boy, Timothy Fletcher." He handed it to the judge. Fletcher witnessed Dawson adding something to Miller's whiskey flask on the morning of his death, hours before Miss Kendrick served him dinner. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Pearl felt dizzy with the implications. "Fletcher was too frightened to come forward initially," Lucas explained. "Dawson threatened his family, but when I found him hiding in Albuquerque, he agreed to provide a sworn statement." Judge Peterson read through the confession slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he finished, he looked up at Sheriff Tanner. "Sheriff, This evidence certainly casts reasonable doubt on Miss Kendrick's conviction. I'm inclined to order her release while we investigate these new allegations against Jasper Dawson." Pearl's hands began to tremble as the reality of what was happening sank in. Could it be possible? After weeks of knowing she would die for a crime she didn't commit, was she about to be freed? Sheriff Tanner looked displeased but nodded reluctantly. "We'll send a telegram to the authorities in Tucson immediately regarding Dawson." "In light of this new evidence," Judge Peterson announced, "I hereby vacate Pearl Kendrick's conviction and order her immediate release. Mr. Dawson will be brought in for questioning, and a new investigation will commence." He banged his gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." The courtroom erupted in excited chatter. Pearl sat frozen in her chair, unable to process the sudden reversal of her fate. Lucas approached her table and gave her a small, reassuring nod. "It's over, Miss Kendrick," he said quietly. "You're free." Tears welled in Pearl's eyes as Deputy Wilson reluctantly removed her handcuffs. She rubbed her wrists, the reality of her freedom still not quite sinking in. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered to Lucas. "No need for that," he replied. "It was the right thing to do." As they exited the courthouse, Pearl blinked in the bright sunlight, feeling as though she were emerging from a dark cave. The same townsfolk who had gathered to watch her hang now stared with a mixture of curiosity, embarrassment, and in some cases, lingering suspicion. "Where will you go now?" Lucas asked as they stood on the courthouse steps. Pearl's smile faded. The question brought a harsh reality crashing down on her. She had no home to return to, no job, and her reputation in Steins Pass was irreparably damaged. "I don't know," she admitted. "I was renting a room above the general store before my arrest, but my things have probably been cleared out by now." Lucas seemed to consider something for a moment. "I have a small cabin on my property," he said finally. "It's nothing fancy, was meant for a ranch hand, but I haven't hired one yet. You'd be welcome to stay there until you figure out your next steps." Pearl looked at him in surprise. "You've already done more than enough, Mr. Irwin. I couldn't impose further." "It's no imposition," he assured her. "The cabin's sitting empty, and after what you've been through." He trailed off, then added more firmly, "Besides, it might be best for you to lay low for a while. Not everyone will be quick to accept your innocence." As if to emphasize his point, Pearl noticed several townspeople watching them with open hostility. Her alleged crime had shocked the community, and some would find it easier to go on believing her guilty despite the evidence. "Perhaps you're right," she conceded. "If you're certain it's not too much trouble, it's settled then." Lucas nodded toward the livery stable. "I need to retrieve my horse. Do you have any belongings to collect? The sheriff's office has a few personal items they took when I was arrested," Pearl replied. "Let's get them, and then we'll head out to my ranch. It's about an hour's ride from town." After collecting Pearl's meager possessions, a small carpet bag containing 2 dresses, some undergarments, a hairbrush, and a locket that had belonged to her mother, they prepared to leave Steins Pass. Lucas helped Pearl onto his chestnut stallion before mounting behind her. The closeness was unexpected and somewhat improper, but given the circumstances, there were few alternatives. Pearl sat stiffly at first, conscious of the strong arms that reached around her to hold the reins. "Relax, Miss Kendrick," Lucas said, amusement coloring his voice. "I promise I don't bite." Pearl felt herself flush but managed to relax slightly as they rode out of town. The familiar buildings of Steins Pass gave way to open country, and with each passing mile, Pearl felt the weight of her ordeal beginning to lift. She was alive. She was free. And somehow, against all odds, this stranger had believed in her innocence when no one else would. "Mr. Irwin," she said as they rode, You still haven't really explained why you went to such lengths for me. Traveling to 3 cities, tracking down witnesses. That goes beyond simply believing in my innocence. Lucas was quiet for a moment, and Pearl wondered if he'd heard her over the rhythmic hoofbeats. I knew Harold Miller, he finally said. Not well, but well enough to know he was careful about who he trusted. When I heard he'd named his housekeeper in his will, I figured there must have been a good reason. It didn't fit that the same woman would then poison him. You investigated because something didn't add up, partly, he admitted. And partly because I've seen what happens when the law moves too quickly and gets the wrong person. Back when I was a ranger. He paused. Let's just say I've made mistakes that can't be undone. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again if there was even a chance you were innocent. His words held a weight that suggested a deeper story, but Pearl didn't press further. Instead, she found herself studying the landscape as they rode rolling hills giving way to more rugged terrain, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional juniper tree. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became more intense. Lucas passed Pearl a canteen and she drank gratefully. Not much further now, he said. Just over that ridge. When they crested the hill, Pearl caught her first glimpse of the Irwin ranch. It wasn't as grand as Miller's had been, but it was substantial, a main house built of sturdy logs, a barn, a corral with several horses, and what appeared to be good grazing land stretching toward distant mountains. Off to one side stood a smaller cabin, which she presumed was to be her temporary home. It's lovely, Pearl said sincerely. Lucas made a non-committal sound. It's a work in progress. Been building it up for 3 years now. They rode down to the main house, where Lucas helped Pearl dismount before tending to his horse. A ranch dog, a black and white border collie, came bounding up to greet them, circling Lucas excitedly before giving Pearl a curious sniff. That's Scout, Lucas explained, patting the dog's head. He's friendly, just cautious with new folks. Pearl bent down to offer her hand to the dog, who gave it a tentative lick after a moment's consideration. He's beautiful, she said, scratching behind Scout's ears. Lucas smiled, the first genuine smile Pearl had seen from him, transforming his serious face. He's the best cattle dog in the territory, aren't you, boy? He said to Scout, who wagged his tail vigorously in agreement. After securing his horse, Lucas led Pearl to the small cabin. It was indeed basic, a single room with a bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a few shelves, but it was clean and solid. It's not much, Lucas said, setting her bag down, but it's private. There's a pump out back for water. Outhouse is just beyond. You're welcome to take your meals at the main house. My housekeeper, Mrs. Ramirez, comes in 3 times a week to cook and clean. She'll be here tomorrow. It's perfect, Pearl assured him, surprising herself with how much she meant it. After the cramped, foul-smelling jail cell, this simple cabin seemed like a palace. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness. No need, Lucas said, moving toward the door. Get some rest, Miss Kendrick. You've had quite a day. We can talk more at supper, say around 6. After he left, Pearl sat on the edge of the bed, the enormity of all that had happened finally hitting her. That morning, she had been marched to the gallows, certain she would die. Now she was free and safe, thanks to a man she hadn't known existed until he rode up to save her life. Pearl unpacked her few belongings and used the water from the pump to wash away the grime of the jail. She changed into her cleanest dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days, and attempted to make herself presentable for supper. As the afternoon light began to soften, Pearl stepped outside to explore her immediate surroundings. The cabin was situated near a small grove of trees, providing some shade and privacy from the main house. The land around the ranch was beautiful in its rugged way, with rolling grasslands stretching toward distant mountains. The sound of chopping drew her attention, and she walked around the cabin to find Lucas splitting firewood. He had removed his vest in the heat, and his shirt clung to his back with sweat as he worked. Pearl watched him for a moment, struck by the fluid strength in his movements. As if sensing her presence, Lucas turned. "Miss Kendrick," he said, embedding the axe in the chopping block and wiping his brow. "Settling in all right?" "Yes, thank you," she replied, suddenly feeling awkward. "I just thought I'd get some fresh air." "Feel free to look around," he said, gesturing toward the property. "Just be careful near the corral, the new mare's still a bit skittish." Pearl nodded and continued her exploration, finding herself drawn to the corral where several horses grazed or dozed in the late afternoon sun. She approached the fence carefully, admiring the animals. A beautiful Palomino mare lifted her head, eyeing Pearl warily. "That's Sunny," Lucas said, coming up beside her. "She's the skittish one I mentioned." "She's gorgeous," Pearl said, staying still as the horse watched them. "She was mistreated by her previous owner," Lucas explained. "Been working with her for a month now, but she still doesn't trust people much." Pearl felt an unexpected kinship with the nervous mare. "Sometimes it's hard to trust again when you've been hurt," she said softly. Lucas gave her a thoughtful look but didn't comment. Instead, he said, "I should clean up before supper." "Make yourself at home, Miss Kendrick." "Pearl," she corrected him. "After all you've done, I think you can call me Pearl," he nodded. "Pearl it is, and I'm Lucas." As he walked away, Pearl found herself watching him, struck by the strangeness of her situation. Hours ago, this man had been a stranger. Now, he was her rescuer, her host, and possibly, though she hardly dared think it, a friend. When Pearl arrived at the main house for supper, she found that Lucas had cleaned up and changed into a fresh shirt. The table was set simply but neatly, and a hearty stew simmered on the stove. "Hope you're hungry," Lucas said, gesturing for her to sit. "I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage a decent stew." "It smells wonderful," Pearl assured him, realizing she was indeed ravenous. Jail food had been barely edible, and she hadn't had an appetite that morning, knowing it was to be her last meal. Lucas served the stew with fresh bread he'd evidently purchased in town that morning before the execution. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Lucas spoke. "I sent word to the sheriff in Tucson about Dawson before we left town," he said. "With any luck, they'll have him in custody soon." Pearl nodded, setting down her spoon. "When you were investigating," she asked, "did you find out why Mr. Miller put me in his will?" "Everyone in town thought it was improper." Lucas's expression darkened. "People like to assume the worst," he said. "But yes, I did find out. Miller kept a journal. In it, he wrote that he knew your father years ago. They fought together in the war. When Miller recognized your family name, he felt obligated to help you, as your father once saved his life." Pearl stared at him, stunned. "My father died when I was 16, she said softly. "He never mentioned knowing Mr. Miller. According to the journal, they lost touch after the war. Miller expressed regret that he hadn't reconnected with your father before his passing. The bequest was his way of honoring that debt." Tears welled in Pearl's eyes. All those rumors, all those suspicious glances from the townsfolk who assumed she must have been Miller's mistress or worse, and all along, it had been a simple act of honoring her father's memory. "Thank you for telling me," she said, wiping away a tear. "It means more than I can say to know the truth." Lucas nodded, looking somewhat uncomfortable with her emotion. "Miller seems to have been a good man in his way, which makes Dawson's betrayal all the worse." They finished their meal with lighter conversation. Lucas told Pearl about his years as a Texas Ranger and his decision to settle in New Mexico territory to start his ranch. Pearl shared stories of her own life growing up in Missouri, losing both parents by the age of 18 and making her way west in search of work and a fresh start. "How did you end up in Steins Pass?" Lucas asked as they cleared the table together. "I was actually heading to Tucson," Pearl admitted. "I had a cousin there who offered me a place to stay while I looked for work. But when the stagecoach stopped in Steins Pass, I saw a notice that Mr. Miller needed a housekeeper and the pay was good. I thought I'd work for a few months, save some money, and then continue to Tucson. I never made it there." "Life has a way of taking unexpected turns," Lucas observed, glancing at her, "for better or worse." "Indeed it does," Pearl agreed, thinking how drastically her life had changed in just that single day. After they had washed the dishes, Lucas walked Pearl back to her cabin, Scout trotting alongside them. The evening was cooling rapidly, the way desert nights often did, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Thank you for dinner," Pearl said as they reached her door. "And for everything else. I still can hardly believe what you did for me today." Lucas shrugged, his expression hidden in the gathering darkness. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow's another day." As Pearl prepared for bed in the small cabin, she found herself replaying the events of the day again and again. The march to the gallows, the sudden appearance of Lucas on his chestnut stallion, the dramatic reversal of her fate, it all seemed like something from a dime novel rather than her real life. And then, there was Lucas Irwin himself. Pearl had met many men in her 26 years, but none quite like him. He was reserved yet passionate about justice, gruff yet kind in his own way, and he had risked much to save a woman he had never met, based solely on his belief that she had been wronged. As she drifted off to sleep on the simple but comfortable bed, Pearl wondered what tomorrow would bring in this new, unexpected chapter of her life. The next morning, Pearl woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin window and the distant sound of cattle. For a moment she was disoriented, forgetting where she was. Then the memories of the previous day came flooding back. The gallows, Lucas, freedom. She dressed quickly in one of her 2 dresses, determined to make herself useful around the ranch. She couldn't stay here indefinitely living off Lucas's charity. Outside, the day was already warming up, promising to be another scorcher. Pearl made her way to the main house, where she found an older Mexican woman working in the kitchen. "Buenos dias," the woman said, looking up with a friendly smile. "You must be Miss Kendrick. I am Maria Ramirez. Senor Irwin told me about you." "Good morning, Mrs. Ramirez. Please call me Pearl," she replied, returning the smile. "I was hoping to help with something. I'm not one for sitting idle." Maria studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "The senor is checking the north pasture. He said he would return for breakfast in an hour. Perhaps you could help me prepare it." Pearl readily agreed, falling into an easy rhythm with Maria as they prepared a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. As they worked, Pearl learned that Maria had been working for Lucas since he first established the ranch 3 years ago. She lived in town with her husband, who worked at the livery stable, and rode out to the ranch 3 days a week. "The senor is a good man," Maria said as she rolled out dough for biscuits. "Quiet, yes, but fair and kind. He works too hard, though. Needs a wife to take care of him." She gave Pearl a meaningful glance that made her blush. "I'm just a temporary guest," Pearl said hastily, "until I figure out my next steps." Maria smiled knowingly, but said nothing more on the subject. Lucas arrived as they were setting the table, looking trail-worn but satisfied. "Cattle all look good," he reported, washing his hands at the basin. "No sign of predators or rustlers." He seemed momentarily surprised to see Pearl helping in the kitchen, but quickly recovered. "You didn't have to help with breakfast," he said. "I wanted to," Pearl replied simply. "I'm not used to being idle, And after all you've done, helping with meals is the least I can do." Lucas looked as though he might argue, but instead nodded and took his seat at the table. Breakfast was a pleasant affair, with Maria drawing Lucas out of his usual reserve with questions about the cattle and news from town. Pearl found herself enjoying their easy rapport and the simple domesticity of the meal. After breakfast, Lucas announced he needed to ride to a neighboring ranch to discuss a cattle drive planned for the following month. "I should be back by mid-afternoon," he told Pearl. "Feel free to rest or explore the property." "Actually," Pearl said, "if Mrs. Ramirez doesn't mind, I'd like to help with whatever chores need doing." Maria beamed. "The girl has good hands and a willing spirit," she told Lucas. "We will manage just fine." Lucas looked between them, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "I can see I'm outnumbered. Just don't work too hard, Pearl. You're still recovering from a difficult time." After he'd ridden off, Pearl threw herself into work alongside Maria. They laundered linens, swept the main house from top to bottom, and prepared a stew for that evening's dinner. The physical labor felt good after weeks of confinement, and Pearl found Maria to be delightful company, full of local stories and gentle wisdom. "How did Lucas end up in Steins Pass?" Pearl asked as they hung sheets to dry in the hot sun. "He mentioned he was a Texas Ranger before." Maria nodded. For many years. He does not speak much of it, but I know there was something that happened on the job. He left the Rangers and wandered for a time before settling here." She gave Pearl a significant look. "He carries shadows with him, that one, but he is a good man beneath them." Pearl found herself increasingly curious about her rescuer. What shadows did he carry? And what had driven him to upend his life as a ranger and start anew in this remote corner of the territory? By early afternoon, with the chores completed, Maria prepared to return to town. "The Señor will be back soon," she said, gathering her things. "The stew needs only to be heated for dinner. I will return on Thursday." After Maria departed, Pearl found herself alone on the ranch for the first time. The sudden silence was both peaceful and slightly unnerving after the companionable bustle of the morning. Restless, she decided to visit the corral again, drawn to the skittish Palomino mare. The horses were dozing in the shade of a lean-to at one end of the corral, but they lifted their heads at Pearl's approach. "Hello, beautiful," Pearl said softly to Sunny, who regarded her with wary eyes. Pearl stood quietly by the fence, not approaching too closely, simply letting the mare become accustomed to her presence. After a few minutes, to Pearl's surprise, Sunny cautiously walked toward her, stopping several feet away. "That's it," Pearl encouraged gently. "I won't hurt you." The mare stretched her neck, nostrils flaring as she caught Pearl's scent. Pearl remained still, speaking in a low, soothing voice. Gradually, Sunny moved closer until she was near enough that Pearl could slowly raise her hand to the fence. The mare hesitated, then delicately extended her muzzle to sniff Pearl's fingers. "Well, I'll be damned," came Lucas's voice from behind her. Pearl startled slightly, but carefully kept her movements slow so as not to frighten Sunny. "She's just getting to know me," she said without turning around. Lucas approached quietly, coming to stand beside Pearl at the fence. "She hasn't let anyone but me that close in the month I've had her," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. Pearl smiled, still focused on the mare. "She just needed to know she was safe." Sunny sniffed at Lucas's familiar scent, then, to Pearl's delight, allowed her to gently stroke her nose. "You have a way with her," Lucas observed. "Have you worked with horses before?" Pearl nodded. "My father raised horses in Missouri." "Not many, but enough that I learned how to handle them from an early age." They stood in companionable silence for a few minutes, both of them gently interacting with the mare, who seemed to be gradually relaxing in their presence. Maria left a stew for dinner, Pearl said eventually. It should be ready whenever you are, Lucas nodded. Let me see to my horse first and I'll join you at the house. As they walked away from the corral, Pearl found herself curious about his meeting. How was your neighbor? Will you participate in the cattle drive? Ben Hollister, Lucas said. He's fine. And yes, we'll drive our combined herds to Santa Fe next month. Better prices there than selling locally. It sounds like quite an undertaking. It is, Lucas admitted. I usually hire a couple of hands to help with the drive, but it's still a lot of work. Over dinner, they discussed the ranch operations further. Pearl found herself increasingly impressed by what Lucas had built in just 3 years: a profitable cattle operation, well-maintained buildings, and plans for expansion. You've accomplished a lot on your own, she observed. Lucas shrugged. It keeps me busy. Mrs. Ramirez mentioned you were a ranger for some time before coming here, Pearl said, hoping she wasn't overstepping. That must have been exciting work. A shadow crossed Lucas's face. Sometimes too exciting, he said tersely, then seemed to catch himself. Sorry. There are parts of those years I prefer not to dwell on. Pearl nodded, recognizing the boundaries he was setting. I understand. We all have chapters we'd rather keep closed. His expression softened slightly. What about you? Any plans for what you'll do next? Pearl considered the question. I'm not sure, she admitted. I can't stay in Steins Pass. Too many people there will always believe I'm guilty, evidence or not. I suppose I could still go to Tucson, though I've lost touch with my cousin over the years. No rush to decide, Lucas said. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to sort things out. The following days fell into a comfortable pattern. Pearl continued to help Maria with household chores on the days she came to the ranch. And on the other days, she found ways to make herself useful, mending clothes, tending a small vegetable garden that had been somewhat neglected, and gradually spending more time with the horses, particularly Sonny, who was steadily becoming more trusting. Lucas was often busy with ranch work, but they shared meals together, and their conversations grew more relaxed and wide-ranging. Pearl learned that Lucas had been born in Georgia but had moved to Texas as a young man to join the Rangers. He had a younger sister living in San Antonio with her husband and children, whom he visited once a year. In turn, Pearl told him more about her own life, her childhood in Missouri, her brief employment as a schoolteacher before moving west, her hopes of eventually having a place to call her own again. On the 5th day of Pearl's stay, they received word from Sheriff Tanner that Jasper Dawson had been apprehended in Tucson and had confessed to poisoning Harold Miller after being confronted with the evidence Lucas had gathered. The sheriff's note, while not exactly apologetic, officially cleared Pearl of all charges. That's that then, Lucas said after reading the message aloud at breakfast. You're officially an innocent woman, though we already knew that. Pearl felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized was still there. It's over, she said, the reality of it finally sinking in. I can move on with my life. Any thoughts on where that might be? Lucas asked, his tone carefully neutral. Pearl hesitated. The truth was, she had been thinking about it a great deal. The past week at the ranch had been unexpectedly pleasant. She enjoyed the work, the peaceful surroundings, and, she had to admit, Lucas's company. But she had no claim on this place or this man, no matter how comfortable their arrangement had become. I thought I might inquire about teaching positions in Santa Fe or Albuquerque, she said finally. With my name cleared, I should be able to find something suitable. Lucas nodded, his expression giving nothing away. Santa Fe's a good town. More opportunities there than in Steins Pass, that's certain. An awkward silence fell between them, unusual after the easy rapport they had developed over the past days. I'll need to travel to Santa Fe anyway for the cattle drive next month, Lucas said abruptly. You'd be welcome to accompany us if you'd like to look into opportunities there. That's very kind of you, Pearl said, surprised and touched by the offer. I'd appreciate that. Later that morning, as Pearl was hanging laundry to dry, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking up, she saw 3 riders coming up the road toward the ranch. Sheriff Tanner and 2 deputies. Anxiety immediately flooded through her. Had something changed? Was Dawson now denying his confession? Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the laundry basket and walked toward the main house to find Lucas. He was already striding out to meet the approaching lawman, his stance wary but not hostile. "Sheriff," he called as the men drew closer. "What brings you out this way?" Sheriff Tanner reined in his horse, his gaze briefly landing on Pearl before returning to Lucas. "Irwin," he acknowledged with a nod. "Got some business to discuss." The men dismounted, and Lucas invited them onto the porch of the main house, where they could talk in the shade. Pearl hung back, uncertain whether she should make herself scarce, but Lucas gestured for her to join them. "Miss Kendrick has a right to hear whatever this is about," he said firmly. "Considering what she's been through." Sheriff Tanner frowned but didn't argue. "Fair enough. It's about Dawson," he said, accepting a cup of water that Lucas offered. "He's been talking. A lot. Turns out Miller's death wasn't his first crime." Pearl and Lucas exchanged a glance. "He's confessed to a string of swindles across 3 territories," the sheriff continued, "and he claims he had a partner in some of them, a man who's still out there." "A partner," Lucas repeated. "Did he give a name?" Sheriff Tanner nodded grimly. "Ellis Morgan mean anything to either of you?" Pearl shook her head, but she noticed Lucas had gone very still. "I know him," Lucas said, his voice suddenly hard. "Or I did, years back. He was wanted in Texas for fraud and suspected of worse. He disappeared before we could bring him in." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Well, according to Dawson, Morgan's been operating in this area for the past year or so, using different names. He's dangerous, killed at least 2 men who caught onto his schemes, if Dawson's telling the truth." "Why are you telling us this?" Pearl asked, sensing there was more to this visit than sharing information. Sheriff Tanner looked uncomfortable. "Dawson claims Morgan has been watching the Miller case closely. He was interested in making sure you were convicted, Miss Kendrick." Pearl felt a chill despite the warm day. "Why would he care about me?" "Because with you hanged for Miller's murder, no one would keep investigating," Lucas said, his expression darkening. "And Morgan's connection to the crime would remain hidden." The sheriff nodded. "That's what we figure. But now that you've been cleared and Dawson's talking, Morgan might see you as a loose end. Both of you," he added, looking at Lucas. "You're the one who gathered the evidence that brought Dawson down." Lucas's jaw tightened. "You think he might come after us?" "It's a possibility we can't discount," Sheriff Tanner said. "I've sent telegrams to lawmen across the territory with Morgan's description, but until he's caught, he left the implication hanging." "We appreciate the warning," Lucas said grimly. "I'll keep an eye out." After the sheriff and his deputies departed, a heavy silence fell between Pearl and Lucas. The peaceful existence they had been building at the ranch suddenly seemed threatened from outside. "I should leave," Pearl said finally. "It's me he's potentially after." "I won't put you in danger after all you've done for me." Lucas's expression hardened. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Morgan is dangerous and cunning. You'd be an easy target on your own." "But no arguments," Lucas cut her off. "I've dealt with men like Morgan before. This ranch is defensible, and I'm not exactly helpless." He gestured to the rifle mounted over the door and the revolver at his hip. Pearl wanted to protest further but recognized the logic in his words. Still, the thought of bringing danger to this man who had already risked so much for her was unbearable. "At least let me help," she said. "I can shoot. My father taught me." Lucas looked skeptical. "I'm serious," Pearl insisted. "I may have been a school teacher and a housekeeper, but I grew up on a farm. I know how to handle a rifle." After a moment's consideration, Lucas nodded. "All right. We'll check your skills tomorrow. In the meantime, we'll take precautions: no riding out alone, keep weapons close, and be alert for any strangers." That night after dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. The beauty of the landscape seemed at odds with the potential danger they now faced. "I'm sorry," Pearl said softly. "If it weren't for me, you wouldn't be in this situation." Lucas turned to look at her, his expression serious in the fading light. "Don't apologize for something that's not your fault," he said. "Besides, I've been looking for Ellis Morgan for years. If he's really in the area, this might be my chance to finally bring him to justice." "What happened between you?" Pearl asked, sensing a personal connection beyond Lucas's former role as a ranger. Lucas was quiet for so long that Pearl thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tight with old anger. 7 years ago, Morgan was running a land swindle in West Texas, selling property he didn't own to settlers. My partner and I were assigned to investigate after complaints started coming in. He paused, his jaw working. "We tracked him to a small town near the border. My partner, James, went ahead while I secured our horses." Pearl waited silently, sensing the difficulty of the story. "Morgan somehow knew we were coming. He ambushed James, shot him in the back." Lucas's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "By the time I got there, James was dead, and Morgan was gone. I tracked him for weeks, but he vanished across the border. The Rangers eventually reassigned me, but I never stopped looking whenever I had the chance." "I'm so sorry," Pearl said softly, understanding now the shadows Maria had mentioned. "Your partner must have been a good friend." "He was like a brother to me," Lucas said, his voice rough with emotion. "We'd been partners for 5 years. He had a wife, a baby on the way." He shook his head. "Morgan took all that away in an instant." Pearl reached out impulsively, placing her hand on his arm. "And now there's a chance he might finally face justice," she said. Lucas looked down at her hand, then up at her face. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a vulnerability he rarely showed. "Yes," he said quietly, "though I'd prefer you weren't caught up in it." Their eyes held for a moment longer than was strictly proper, and Pearl became acutely aware of the warmth of his arm beneath her hand. She withdrew it slowly, a flush rising to her cheeks. "We should turn in," Lucas said, standing abruptly. "Morning comes early." As promised, the next day Lucas took Pearl to a clearing behind the barn to test her shooting skills. He set up several targets, cans, and bottles at varying distances. "Let's see what you can do," he said, handing her his Winchester rifle. Pearl took it confidently, checking the load before bringing it to her shoulder. She took aim at the nearest target, breathed steadily, and fired. The can flew off the fence post. Lucas raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Pearl couldn't help but smile at his expression as she turned her attention to the next target, which was considerably farther away. This shot required more concentration, but again, she hit her mark. By the time she had fired 6 shots, hitting 5 of the targets, Lucas was looking at her with newfound respect. "Your father taught you well," he conceded, taking the rifle back. "Though I hope you never have to use those skills against a real person." "So do I," Pearl agreed soberly. Over the next week, they maintained their vigilance while continuing the daily work of the ranch. Pearl found that the enforced caution actually brought them closer together, as they were rarely out of each other's sight for long. She learned more about ranching from Lucas. helping with tasks she had never attempted before riding out to check fences, assisting with minor veterinary care for the cattle, even learning how to rope from horseback. In turn, she taught him some of her own skills, from more efficient mending techniques to her grandmother's recipe for peach cobbler when Maria brought fresh peaches from town. They took to sitting on the porch each evening, sometimes talking, sometimes just enjoying the quiet and each other's company. Pearl found herself looking forward to these moments more than anything else in the day. One evening, about 10 days after the sheriff's warning, Lucas surprised her by asking, "Do you still plan to leave for Santa Fe after the cattle drive?" Pearl looked over at him, trying to read his expression in the gathering darkness. "I haven't decided," she admitted. The truth was, the idea of leaving the ranch and Lucas had become increasingly difficult to contemplate. Lucas nodded slowly. "The offer to stay remains open," he said carefully. "The ranch could use someone with your skills, and Sonny would miss you." Pearl felt her heart quicken at his words. Was he simply talking about employment, or was there more to his offer? Before she could formulate a response, they heard the sound of approaching hooves, a single rider coming fast down the road to the ranch. Lucas was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun. "Get inside," he told Pearl, his voice tense. She hesitated, unwilling to leave him alone to face a potential threat. "Please, Pearl," he said, more urgently. She reluctantly retreated to the doorway of the house but refused to go fully inside. From her position, she could see Lucas standing alert on the porch, his hand ready near his holster. The rider came into view, a young boy on a lathered horse, not the threat they had feared. "Mr. Irwin," the boy called, reining in his mount. "Mr. Irwin, Ma sent me to warn you." Lucas relaxed slightly, recognizing the son of his nearest neighbor. "Slow down, Billy. What's happened?" The boy, no more than 12, was breathless with exertion and excitement. "A man came to our place asking about you and a woman staying with you. Pa was in town, so Ma told him she didn't know nothing, but he didn't believe her. He was scary. Mr. Irwin had mean eyes. After he left, Ma sent me to warn you while she took the little ones to the Johnsons' place." Lucas's expression had hardened again. "What did this man look like, Billy?" "Tall, with a scar down his cheek, wore fancy clothes, but they were dusty from the trail, had a silver-handled revolver." The boy swallowed. "Ma said he might be meaning to do you harm." "You did right to come warn us," Lucas said, his tone grim. "Where did the man go after he left your place?" "Headed east, toward town, but Ma said he might double back once he was out of sight." Lucas nodded. "I want you to ride straight to the Johnsons and stay with your Ma and siblings. Tell Mr. Johnson what you've told me. He'll know to send word to the sheriff." After the boy had galloped off, Lucas turned to Pearl, his expression grave. "That was Morgan, no doubt about it. The scar matches his description." Pearl felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "What do? We prepare," Lucas said simply. "He'll come tonight, I expect. He knows we've been warned now." The next few hours were a flurry of preparation. Lucas moved their horses from the stable to a small corral behind the barn, where they would be safer from fire, a common tactic of men like Morgan. He checked and loaded every weapon in the house, positioning them strategically. Pearl helped him board up the most vulnerable windows, leaving just enough space to fire through if necessary. As night fell, Lucas insisted Pearl try to get some rest while he took the first watch. "I'll wake you in a few hours," he promised. "We both need to be alert." Pearl doubted she could sleep under the circumstances but retreated to the small bedroom to at least rest. Lucas had decided they should both stay in the main house rather than having Pearl in the cabin, where she would be isolated and more vulnerable. Despite her anxiety, Pearl must have dozed off, because she awakened with a start when Lucas gently touched her shoulder. "It's just past midnight," he whispered. "Still quiet out there, but that doesn't mean much." Pearl sat up, instantly alert. "I'll take watch now," she said. "You need rest too." Lucas looked like he might argue, but then nodded. "Wake me at the slightest sound that seems out of place," he instructed, handing her a loaded rifle. She positioned herself by the window in the main room, her eyes scanning the moonlit yard for any movement. The night was eerily still, with not even a breeze to rustle the leaves of the trees around the property. For over an hour, Pearl maintained her vigilant watch, fighting off occasional waves of drowsiness. Then, just as the moon was setting, she caught a flicker of movement at the edge of the yard, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness of the trees. Her heart pounding, Pearl moved silently to the bedroom door. "Lucas," she whispered urgently. "Someone's out there." He was instantly awake, reaching for his gun as he rose. "Where?" "By the large oak near the corral," she replied, returning to her position by the window. Lucas joined her, peering cautiously through the gap in the boards covering the window. After a moment, he spotted what she had seen: a figure crouching in the shadows, slowly making its way toward the house. "That's him," Lucas confirmed grimly. "Stay low and away from the windows. He'll likely try to draw us out." As if on cue, a voice called from the darkness. "Irwin, I know you're in there with the woman. Come out and maybe I'll let her live." Lucas's jaw tightened, but he made no response. Instead, he moved to a different window for a better angle, signaling for Pearl to stay where she was. "Don't think I won't burn you out," Morgan shouted again. "I've done it before." A tense silence followed. Pearl could hear her own heartbeat hammering in her ears as she waited, rifle ready. Then, without warning, the sound of breaking glass came from the back of the house, followed by the unmistakable smell of kerosene and smoke. "Fire bottle at the back door," Lucas said tersely. "He's trying to smoke us out." He moved quickly to the kitchen, grabbing a bucket of water they had prepared for just such a possibility. Pearl kept her eyes on the front yard, knowing Morgan might use the distraction to approach. Sure enough, she caught movement, a figure darting from the shadow of the oak toward the front porch. "He's coming to the front," she called to Lucas. She took aim as the figure reached the steps, but before she could fire, the front door crashed open, kicked in with tremendous force. Pearl fell back, momentarily disoriented as splinters flew. A tall man with a jagged scar down his right cheek stood in the doorway, revolver raised. His eyes locked on Pearl and a cold smile spread across his face. "There you are," he said, leveling his gun at her. "The woman who should have hanged." Pearl froze, the rifle suddenly heavy in her hands. She had never shot at a person before, and despite her practice, she hesitated at the crucial moment. That hesitation nearly cost her life. Morgan's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Lucas appeared from the kitchen, his own gun already aimed. "Drop it, Morgan," he shouted. "It's over." Morgan's eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with hatred. "Irwin," he spat. "Should have known you'd be mixed up in this. Still trying to play the hero." "I said drop your weapon," Lucas repeated, his voice deadly calm. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Morgan swiftly shifted his aim from Pearl to Lucas and fired. Lucas dove to the side as the bullet splintered the doorframe where his head had been. He rolled and came up firing, his shot catching Morgan in the shoulder. The outlaw staggered but didn't fall. He fired again, wildly this time, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling. Pearl had recovered from her initial shock. As Morgan turned to fire at Lucas again, she raised her rifle and pulled the trigger. The shot wasn't perfect. It hit Morgan in the leg rather than center mass, but it was enough to knock him off balance. Lucas seized the advantage, launching himself at Morgan and tackling him to the ground. The outlaw's revolver skittered across the floor as the two men grappled violently. Despite his wounds, Morgan fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. He landed a solid punch to Lucas's jaw, then reached for a knife in his boot. "Lucas, he has a knife," Pearl shouted, unable to get a clear shot with the men struggling so closely together. Lucas saw the blade flash in the firelight and grabbed Morgan's wrist, the two men straining against each other's strength. For a heart-stopping moment, the knife inched closer to Lucas's throat. Pearl looked frantically around for something, anything to help. Her eyes landed on a heavy iron skillet sitting on the stove. She grabbed it and rushed forward. With all her strength, she brought the skillet down on Morgan's head. The outlaw went limp instantly, the knife falling from his suddenly slack fingers. Lucas rolled away, breathing heavily, blood trickling from a cut on his cheek. "Good timing," he managed, looking up at Pearl with a mixture of relief and admiration. "Are you badly hurt?" she asked anxiously, kneeling beside him. "I'll live," he assured her, sitting up with a wince. "We need to secure him before he comes around." They bound Morgan's hands and feet with rope, Lucas checking his wounds to ensure they weren't life-threatening. The shoulder injury was bleeding steadily, but didn't appear to have hit anything vital, and the leg wound was a clean through and through. "He'll stand trial," Lucas said with grim satisfaction. "For James, for his part in Miller's murder, and for everything else he's done." The fire at the back door had largely burned itself out, having done minimal damage thanks to their preparations. By dawn, they had cleaned up the worst of the destruction and sent word to town via a passing ranch hand. By mid-morning, Sheriff Tanner and his deputies arrived to take Morgan into custody. "You two all right?" the sheriff asked, surveying the damage to the house and the still unconscious Morgan. "We'll manage," Lucas said, standing close to Pearl. Morgan talked some before he passed out again, confirmed everything Dawson said about their partnership and then some. "He'll hang for what he's done." Sheriff Tanner nodded. "Good work, both of you." He glanced between them with an expression that suggested he was noticing their proximity to each other. "Miss Kendrick, seems you have quite a knack for finding trouble and for getting out of it." "I had help," Pearl said simply, her gaze meeting Lucas's. After the sheriff and his men departed with their prisoner, a strange quiet fell over the ranch. The danger that had been hanging over them was gone, and with it, the immediate reason for Pearl to remain under Lucas's protection. They stood together on the porch, watching the dust from the departing lawmen's horses settle back onto the road. "It's over," Pearl said softly. Lucas turned to her. "Yes," he agreed, but there was a question in his eyes. Pearl took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "You asked me yesterday if I still plan to leave for Santa Fe," she reminded him. "I never gave you my answer." "And what is your answer?" Lucas asked, his voice carefully neutral. Pearl met his gaze directly. "I don't want to leave," she admitted. "Not unless you want me to." Something in Lucas's face softened, the reserve he typically maintained giving way to genuine emotion. "I don't want you to leave," he said quietly. "These past weeks, having you here." He struggled to find the words, unused to expressing such feelings. Pearl felt her heart quicken. "Are you offering me employment, Mr. Irwin?" she asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Lucas shook his head slowly, taking a step closer to her. "No," he said. "I'm asking you to consider staying as more than an employee, much more." Pearl's breath caught in her throat. "Lucas." "I know it's sudden," he continued, the words coming more freely now. "We've only known each other a short time, but when I saw Morgan aiming at you last night, I realized something. The thought of losing you was unbearable." He took her hands in his touch gentle despite the calluses on his fingers. "I don't have much to offer beyond this ranch and myself, but both are yours if you want them. If you need time to consider," Pearl cut him off, rising on her toes to press her lips gently to his. After a moment of surprise, Lucas responded, his arms encircling her waist as he deepened the kiss. When they finally separated, both a little breathless, Pearl smiled up at him. "I don't need time to consider," she said softly. "I want to stay with you." The smile that transformed Lucas's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. "You're sure?" he asked, still holding her close. "More sure than I've been about anything in a very long time," Pearl assured him. "When I was marched to that gallows, I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning because of you." 2 months later, Pearl Kendrick became Pearl Irwin in a small ceremony at the ranch, with Maria and her husband, neighboring ranchers, and even Sheriff Tanner in attendance. Judge Peterson, somewhat chastened by his role in nearly hanging an innocent woman, performed the ceremony with particular solemnity. Sonny, the Palomino mare, now fully trusting of Pearl, had been adorned with flowers for the occasion and watched the proceedings from her corral with what seemed like approval. As they exchanged vows under a canopy of blue sky, neither Pearl nor Lucas could quite believe the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a near execution to a love neither had been looking for, but both had desperately needed. Later that evening, as they stood on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the landscape in golds and reds, Lucas pulled Pearl close. "When I rode into Steins Pass that day," he said softly, "I only intended to save your life. I never imagined you would end up saving mine in return." Pearl looked up at him questioningly. "I was existing, not living," Lucas explained, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Going through the motions, building this ranch, but always alone with my ghosts. You changed that." Pearl leaned into his embrace, thinking of all they had overcome to reach this moment. "It seems impossible that something as terrible as my almost execution could lead to such happiness." "Not impossible," Lucas said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Just unlikely. Like a cowboy with evidence riding up at the last possible moment." Pearl laughed softly. "Or a schoolteacher turned housekeeper wielding a skillet against a dangerous outlaw." As the last light of day faded from the sky, they stood together on the threshold of their shared future, a future neither of them could have imagined just months before, but one they would build together, day by day, on a foundation of truth, courage, and a love born in the most unexpected of circumstances. The years that followed brought many changes to the Irwin Ranch. With Pearl's practical sense complementing Lucas's vision, the ranch prospered and expanded. They added more cattle, improved the main house, and hired several permanent hands to help with the increasing workload. Pearl eventually opened a small school on the ranch for the children of their workers and neighboring families, finding joy in returning to teaching while still helping Lucas manage their growing enterprise. 2 years after their marriage, they welcomed their first child, a son they named James, after Lucas's fallen partner. 3 years later, a daughter followed, whom they called Elizabeth after Pearl's mother. Lucas's sister and her family visited from San Antonio, strengthening family bonds that had been stretched thin during Lucas's solitary years. Pearl's cousin from Tucson was located and invited to the ranch, beginning a renewed relationship that brought Pearl a connection to her past she had thought lost forever. And each year, on the anniversary of the day Lucas rode in to stop Pearl's execution, they would sit together on their porch, marveling at the unlikely path that had brought them together and the life they had built from what had nearly been an ending. In Steins Pass, the story of the innocent woman saved from the gallows by a determined cowboy became something of a local legend, retold in the saloon and around dinner tables, growing more dramatic with each telling. Few knew the full truth of what had followed the danger, the growing love, and the family that bloomed in the aftermath of justice restored. But Pearl and Lucas knew. And as they watched their children grow, their ranch thrive, and their love deepen with each passing year, they considered themselves the most fortunate of people to have found each other against all odds, and to have built a life rich with purpose, passion, and peace where once there had been only shadows and gallows.